Well, the reason I follow recipes when I cook is that I'm not a professional cook. So this gives me a way to start to do two excuses. One is that last night I realized that I had a manuscript for 2 hours. So I've been preparing well, but I mean, and I think maybe as designers, what we do, we prepare and we prepare and we prepare. And when we are in the situation, we actually have to act with what there is. So I will not throw away this manuscript, but I'll only use it in parts. So that was the first excuse. The other one has to do with, as Emma was saying, that I know bare to nothing about service design. And I, of course, feel very honored to be invited here to talk to this collective knowledge of service design. To me, and to be quite honest, when I first met service design, to me it looked like something that I remembered from the late 60s. Because I come from the beginning from information and computer science before turning into design. And we had something that was called activity graphs, which were laying out flows in organization, etc. So I thought that, well, now we have customer journeys and touch points. It looked like activity graphs with a pretty interface, kind of. So is that all there is to it? And then I understood that it's much more to it. And actually, I have 3 PhD students that are, you can say, in the field of service design, looking at things like the controversies around opening production, the materiality of services, and one trying to understand why we never have been sustainable or can be that. And I actually also know Stefan, who is a key person in this community. So that's the little I know. What I've decided to talk about today is designing futures and utopian dreams. I'll start off in 1933 with the science fiction novel by H.G. Wells, The Shape of Things to Come. What Wells did was he projected into 2106 in 5 chapters what was happening. Actually, he predicted the Second World War, and then he was wrong about a lot of things. When going through the word Renaissance and ending in the modern state as a kind of utopia. Given this theme of the conference, I thought I would not talk about the shape of things to come, but being in service of things to come, on utopia's loss and futures in the making. And I've tried to reflect upon the experiences from more than 40 years, actually over 5 decades. So that's the advantage of growing older. Then there's many not so good things about it. I'd rather be around 30 as Dominic. But that's... this name says Pelle and Malmö University, and on the back side I wrote collective designer part of. So that's the identity I'll try to play with during this hour. But I need to start somewhere, and I don't want to start with H.G. Wells, but with Thomas More's Utopia, the dream of a good place, but not being nowhere, about which Oscar Wilde wrote, a map of the world that does not include Utopia is not worth even glancing at, for it leaves out the one country which humanity always is landing on. And when humanity lands there, it looks out and seeing a better country, sets sail, Progress is the realization of utopias. Well, maybe for the moderns, but I'm not so sure about this view on utopia. This time, about 2 years ago, I was reached by a very special thing. A mailboat, a beautifully crafted kind of flask post. Reaching me, it had been fairly wide around on its way over the seas, from the islands of Orkney, via the US West Coast and the Silicon Valley, ending up on my shores in Scandinavia. It was an invitation to share concerns about how futures are being made at specific locations of design and innovation. The initial message from Orkney was from an archaeologist of futures, here in Lancaster, known as Laura Watts. This is what she wrote. I write this message to be taken in the ocean current, to that far-off continental coast, to that mythical place of Silicon Valley. You echo in the wireless network wind on my cheeks, from the mental camphor around my keyboard, in logos that litter my web windows, in the very essence and existence of my mouse. I know your word is by its absent presence in mine. You haunt me, your home haunts me. Where does Silicon Valley not haunt? You live in that place where my future is imagined and rolled out, rolled over my bones, over my home, my hills, my islands. I make future from the flotsam and jetsam left behind when people make the world. People like designers, whose choices, whose socio-material practices, imaginings, stories, and digital ink make the word one way and not another. Maybe you don't see it that way. I see it as a future-making practice. And Pelle, design researcher from Copenhagen and Malmö, would agree with me. Every practice has residues. I just collect those residues from design and paste them together, play with them, try out lots of different ways they go together. I reconstruct them in lots of different ways. If design is a future-making practice, then I reconstruct design futures in lots of different ways. Send me some residues and I'll show you what I mean. Tell me about design in your word. Help me understand. And tell me about you, yours from Orkney, the future archaeologist. I will in the coming hour do so, but to further frame the presentation, let me also introduce another participant in this mailboat travels, the anthropologist of technoscience from the Valley, here in Lancaster, better known as Lucy Suchma. Sending off her mailboat message from the beach of Pescadero, she wrote, "To get started, let me bring in a muse whose voice has likely traveled the distance between us. A peculiar attitude to history," Donna Haraway writes, "characterizes those who live in the time-space of the techno-present. We, tend to describe everything as new, as revolutionary, as future-oriented, as solutions to problems of the past. The arrogance and ignorance of this attitude hardly needs comment. However, if revolutions here are mostly hype, discontinuities and muted ways of being are not. This peculiar attitude expressed itself vividly to me one evening around 1995, as I was driving my car down Hillway Avenue in Palo Alto, listening to National Array Public Radio. The future arrives sooner here, stated the Silicon Valley technologist who was being interviewed. And in posting a singular universal future, his words reiterated as well a past in the form of a diffusionist model of change. I will return to this mailboat conversation towards the end of the talk, and my response as a collective designer part of, also known as Pelle. But let's set sail for this journey of Utopia's lost and future in the making. So we've been through the prologue, and I've divided this journey into 4 chapters of Futures in the Makers and Utopia's Lost. Democracy at Work, which spans experience from the 70s, work-oriented design, experience from the 80s, digital Bauhaus experience from the 90s, design things experience from the first century in this millennium, and finally futures in the making, which spans where we are right now. And there will be an epilogue about the collective designer. So, chapter 1, the Utopia of democracy at work, mid-70s, in which the managerial control over work and technology is challenged. A negotiation model is tested, laws and agreements are changed, and a local trade union strategy is developed. This brings me exactly 40 years, or 40 years minus 2 months back in time, to the first international conference, actually to the first conference I was to. And it was called Alternative Organizations. My contribution, which was my first paper to a conference, at that time we did not have computers. And I was trying to elaborate on a model for how people locally at the workplace could have an influence on the new technology that was introduced at that time. And at that time, what the worries were that people would be controlled, that de-skilling would take place, that managerial control over the workforce would be strengthened by the introduction of new technology. So the question was, were there models for how one could work? And this paper, based on liberation theology and Marxism, basically, wasn't a great paper. But the idea was there. But the reason I mentioned this conference is that at this conference was also Kristen Nygaard. Kristen Nygaard, I think, is maybe the most important person in early participatory design. In the early 70s, together with the Norwegian Metal Workers Union and a lot of other people, they started to deal with these problems of what to do with new technology. I should say, Kristen was brought into this by his kids, you could say, because they were socialists, and his wife was, and he was a liberal politician, partly. But more than that, he was a very talented computer scientist. Actually, one of the fathers of object-oriented program before Smalltalk, etc. They had done some very interesting work in Norway at local workplaces, trying to understand how people could have an influence on this new technology entering the workplace. And I made my presentation, and other colleagues, and we were kind of, just as strange as I might be to this audience, we were even more strange to that audience of organizational management at that time. But so I don't know how well it went. But in the evening of the last night, Kristen took me and a few colleagues into his room, and he said, "You have to learn to speak better English if the revolution is going to succeed." So I don't know how well that went, but at least we had no revolution. Later on, we started similar projects all around Scandinavia, and I was involved in one called Demos for Democratic Planning. And in one of the workshops we were working with, they were repairing locomotive engines, and so it was about a planning system being introduced there. And so we came with this strategy, not too far away from the paper presented that I just showed you. And it should be very democratic, so we asked there should be a local union meeting with every member present, and they should vote whether they wanted to go for this or not. And so they did. They all came, and they voted for doing this project. And half a year, or maybe a little bit more down the road, over a beer, and when we had a workshop, I said, "Do you know why we voted for starting this?" And they said, "Actually, when you presented it on the member meeting, no one understood a single word of what you were saying, but we thought you were nice guys, so we'd give you a chance." So I think it's very much a question about building up trust over time and showing that you're worth that trust. Actually, not everyone was so trustful to us, because this was the ultra left, for instance, depicted as warning us. We were in a lot of workplaces, kind of warning for the trade union spies at the workplace. So its attention also was already there. But basically, this is I won't go through it. This is the model that was developed. It basically says that trade unions should have their own independent, locally working group preparing for negotiations with management, and then the traditional system would go into play. And basically, this came into practice many places, and eventually even laws and agreements got changed. And it was very different. Now we're in Lancaster, but the most influential person in the field of this kind of change at that time was Ian Mumford from Manchester. And this was so much against Enid's work. So it was controversial also in that sense. We were thinking that she was still playing the old managerial control game, which had to be challenged. Be it with that as it was, she's a great woman. But if we look, what is it like today? Well, how does democracy at work look today? Well, it's not really an issue. People don't talk about it. Trade unions are really being downplayed. We talk about technical innovation. We talk about new public management, etc. So I don't know if this is a sad story or not. And there's also another relation to UK from the 70s, and that has to do with Lucas Aerospace and the plan for alternative production. We got in contact with one another and tried to develop shared interests, but and that led me to the next chapter. To the utopia of work-oriented design, in which the political technology and the de-skilling of the worker is challenged. A utopia where workers craft new technology is imagined through serious play and prototyping in language games of design and use. The ground for alternative production is outlined. So let me start in 1982. We're in the boardroom of the Swedish National Graphic Union. There's a board meeting going on. On the agenda is a contradiction in terms, a utopian project on new computer-based technology for skills. As head of the project, I had been invited to report, and decisions on whether or not to continue with the project will be made. Future scenarios have been presented before, but it's all up in the air, abstract and unreal to many of the participants. There are protagonists and antagonists. The chairman is very skeptical. With me, in a plastic bag filled with different shaped wooden mice, mock-ups of future interaction devices we've just designed. The turning point in the meeting is when I bring out the mice of the bag and let them circulate around the table. Participants are really keen to get hands-on experience. The utopian future became not only tangible, but also imaginable. Future work on the project was approved with acclamation. I will later argue that the performance of one thing, a designed object, had entered into another thing, a decision-making meeting, and altered its performance. So in this project, was a collaboration with different professions, including industrial designers and product designers, management people, sociologists, historians, and of course, as a basic, typographer and lithographers. The turning point in the project came when it turned out that everyone was so positive to this new alternative technology, and it was presented on different kind of flow charts, etc. But it turned out that, again, same story as with the locomotive repair shop. People liked it because they liked us. We were the designers. We were their designers, but they were not participating in the design. And this really changed when we started to work with mock-ups and prototypes and different kinds of games as designed by doing and designed by playing. For instance, the desktop laser printer that you see on the picture here is probably the most well-known non-existing artifact from the Utopia project. It was set up to, well, we had been to Rochester Institute of Technology in the US and seen something, this is 82, so remember, seen something they called a desktop laser printer. They found it down in the basement somewhere. It was a prototype of something. And they said that this thing could print on normal paper. It would probably only cost like $10,000. Really, really cheap compared to a composing machine. So what if something like this could be part of how journalists and typographers collaborated? So this mock-up then became part of a game trying out different ways of organizing work. Yeah, maybe I should show this picture as well. This was a collaboration, my first collaboration also with industrial designers. And here's a story, and Denmark was part of our team, was Denmark, Norway, Sweden, and Finland. And I was going down there, and on the airplane, I found this coffee pot to the left. They still use it. And I thought it was kind of ugly. With a motorcycle handle on something here. Enough of that, and then I visited Morten, a colleague in Denmark. Denmark always being very fancy about design and style, and he had the coffee pot up to the right, the Stelton that we can see in Museum of Modern Art and other places. I really want something like that. I won't tell you the whole story, but the point is that the one to the corner down left was developed by the industrial designers that we worked with, and I had no idea. So, and their process, which very much became our process, was to work with different kind of mock-ups and prototypes, feedback, working with people, starting out with interviews and being in the cabin, standard procedure. In all kinds of ways. And it also turned out that the very reason behind that coffee pot was health problems for the cabin crew in serving coffee. So it actually solved an important problem. I just brought this story with me because I think it's and I did not make that connection until much later. But I realized that a lot of the prototyping and mock-up work that we did, we actually learned from industrial design. So here is basically the model that we developed, if we go to the theoretical level. It was based, very influenced by Wittgenstein's late work, and it would say something like, well, if we simplify it, to your right you have one kind of language game. The language game, say, talked by management. Let's make it that simple. And to the left, and to the left you have the language game talked by staff, people, workers was in this case. And so the simple idea was that could one construct a third language game which took properties from both and made it possible for everyone to, without understanding one another, to bring something back and say, okay, this is what we want to do. I don't understand what you're doing, but we're doing this together, and from my point of view, this makes sense. And you can bring in, so for the designer to set this up with mock-ups, prototypes, games, or whatever, became the idea. And behind all this, you can say, we could quote Wittgenstein from his notes, and say, where he says, if a lion could speak, you would not understand him. We would not understand a lion. So it's a very different model from a communication model that presupposes that we understand one another. It starts out instead from the idea that we can actually do things together without understanding one another, or if it makes sense to where you come from. Well, this project developed, and I won't go into the details of it because it's part of what I've had to cut away here. But towards the end of the project, we had an interview from the MIT Technical Review, and they wrote like this. So the impact of Utopia is continuing to expand, and the idea that workers and their union have an important role in the design of new technology. It's reaching a wider and wider audience. Today, Scandinavia, tomorrow, perhaps the rest of the world. Well, that's not at all how it developed. We have history to look back. But one thing, and another thing that did not happen, which I thought was very exciting at that time, was the meeting with first people from Lucas Aerospace and later from Greater London Council and Greater London Enterprise Board, who had a company called Whitechapel. And they had the competence to produce the graphic system that had been developed in Utopia. And we're very far into getting this to work when Thatcher abolished GLC and Gleb, and the rest is history. So there were very interesting things going on that never happened. In 1984, and this will be my last story from the Utopia project, we had a meeting out in the archipelago in Stockholm. And to that meeting, we had a very special thing going on. On the tractor, there was transported the first Mac 128K. So we had it out there. So we had our prototype, and out there in this beautiful June archipelago of Stockholm was this Mac. And I told this story to one of our PhD students, and she was fascinated by it and started to look into how it went when Apple launched the first Mac with the Ridley Scott movie or commercial, ending to say that, so it's like the greenies from IBM sitting there, and here comes in this new thing. And you'll see why 1984 will not be like 1984, it's said in the end. And if we look today, what Apple is participating in, well, it's not 1984, it's 2014. But it very much looked like the 1984, doesn't it? So let's move on to, so let's move on to the 90s. and the Utopia of a Digital Bauhaus, in which the hybris of the creative class and the 2.0 IT industry is challenged. A Digital Bauhaus manifesto for a new unit of politics, art, and technology is proclaimed, and a school is built to manifest this utopia. I will not say much about this, but let's start just to read a little bit from the manifesto. It starts quoting Oskar Schlemmer's 1923 manifesto. Today we can do no more than to ponder the total plan, lay the foundations and prepare the building stones. We exist, we have the will, we are producing. In this we can only conquer, despite our knowledge of the contradiction inherent in the Bauhaus, despite the historical tendencies away from a socially responsible movement towards a technology hostile to man, despite a century of obstacles and failures in the attempt to establish a third culture that already the Bauhaus tried to create. In spite of all this, but certainly not without ironic distance and postmodern lost innocence, we see no more constructive and practical way to unite the hard scientific and technological side of the Enlightenment project with the soft ethical and aesthetic sides than the grand vision from the Bauhaus Manifesto, put in the hands of a young generation of nerds and digerati. Hence, this is also our vision of an arena, a meeting place, a school, a research center, and the creative and socially useful meetings between art and technology, and ending digital designers of all countries unite, of course. Well, the school was set up. It, in many ways, worked quite well. We had, but things started to happen. The humanistic and user-oriented orientation, maybe it was too idealistic. I'll come back to that later on. But in concrete, the school was built. We had first a research center that we called the Interactive Institute, with studios for space and narrativity. At some time, after like 5 years, the commercial pressure of being economically sustainable, not doing, being market-oriented was so strong, so it has to close. We started a new research center in the school called Medea, with living labs that I'll talk about later on. But it's also about now to close because of the neoliberal notion of innovation. It's so much pressure to do business as usual that it's very difficult to hold up a digital Bauhaus in these days. In the beginning, when we started in 98, in the press we could read things that we were kind of the modern brown shirts coming in, disciplining art and blah, 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 etc. We were not accused by that towards the end. But there had also been fantastic things happening here, and this is just some of the theses that students from our digital Bauhaus has produced and keep on producing all the time. So it's also a story of hope and lots of interesting things happening. So we exist, we are producing, as they said in 1923. Chapter 4, in which hegemonic power and the political system is challenged by design, by reinventing the old Nordic thing, exploring participation and representation across parliamentary technologies and design experiments, suggesting an agonistic model of design. And for me personally, as being part of the collective designer, this period very much started in a collaboration under the acronym of ATELUR with colleagues around in Europe, and we produced a book called Design Things. But in the end, as you might see from the cover to the left, the publisher could not accept a collective authorship. So names are written there. But as tell a story, it's very difficult because on the one hand we know that all the stories we tell, all the things we do are entangled in all kinds of ways, and still there always has to be a name, Pelle or Emma or whatever there should be. And I think that's one of our big problems. But we were looking into spaces like the Lika building and trying to understand what could the design space of the future be. But in many ways, it's ended up with reconnecting to science and technology studies, and not least the work by Bruno Latour and followers in reassembling the object of design, going beyond both user-centeredness and object orientation. So the picture that Latour paints basically is to say that the problem with the social sciences is the social. We have no clue what the social is. He's instead suggesting that we have to look at the collective of humans and non-humans. We have to do that through fieldwork accounts, to follow the actor, tracing, and map making. Well, if this is true for the social sciences, can we not say the same thing for design? What about if we get rid of the object and then replaces that with a thing? And with the thing here, we understand it etymologically, going back to the old Nordic assemblies and rituals where people met to literally deal with matters of concern. So you have this shift from an isolated object to an assembly of people and things. So if that is what design is about, then how do we go about experiment, prototyping, drawing things together, trailblazing new ways, futures, many of them. Another way to put it is with this design thing is that it's interesting, I think, in a way, it places itself somewhere between the traditional parliament in one form or another and the scientific laboratory. And that I think is where we are acting. And for us to work with this has basically meant working with something which we call living labs, which of course nothing that we have invented. A lot of people have living labs. The basic thing about our living labs has been that they are local. They work with the people and the stuff that exists. In our case, in the city of Malmö, we've been working with 3 labs, one in the neighborhood, one more with alternative cultural production, and one is a makerspace. And in this, we have, and we don't see this as projects. I think this should be, we see this as thinking activities, as ongoing activities where you have to be prepared to network, to make things happen as you go along, finding resources, connecting people, ongoing all the time. I won't go in much to it today, but just to summarize that here are some of the conditions that we see. And much of this happened in the public sphere. So you go from one public sphere to multiple plebeian publics, as Dewey would say. And democracy goes from consensus in hegemonic consensus into what Chantal Mouffe will call agonism. That's the idea that people, just like with the language games in a way, that people can come together, they agree that they don't agree, but they're still trying to do something together. With participation, it's not so much maybe a question of representation as more of articulation, and governance is a question of going away from top of the pyramid towards heterogeneous, lots of bottom-up networks. Yeah, let's drop that. With these living labs, I should say, again, sounds like a great idea, fantastic things happen, people do great things, but it's getting closed down. Doesn't produce enough jobs with the standard definition. Doesn't produce enough companies. So EU will not support this. Again, the neoliberal agenda comes in and says that well, this, and then things, and there's still hope, because someone says that, okay, it created this and this and this and this. Maybe we should put that into the Horizon 2020 agenda and open up some stuff. So there's always this ongoing, but it's not to dance on roses. Final example, the utopia of democratic design and innovation, in which the neoliberal notion of innovation, governance, and sustainability are challenged from the margins of society by people struggling in multiple futures, making practices, making space, and reinventing democratic things. Har du sett Malmö, har du sett världen? This was the underdog slogan 2 decades ago when the industrial town of Malmö in the south of Sweden was demounted and its 250,000 inhabitants were not doing too well. Shipyard and plant closures, high unemployment, class and ethnic segregation, crisis, no future. In strong colloquial and ironic language, the slogan said, if you have seen Malmö, you have seen the rest of the world. This is the moment when the march towards a more sustainable city started. The bridge to the continent, the new university, the transformation of the deserted harbor into exemplary sustainable architecture and ecosystems and home for a prosperous IT and media industry, successful culture, design and innovation arenas, and a flourishing entrepreneurial creative class. International media often depicts the city of Malmö less favorable. Sporadic riots in the most vulnerable districts and numerous gang and criminal network-related killings, forming a picture of a violent, multi-ethnic, segregated town. A perhaps more nuanced scenario is given by the Commission for a Sustainable Malmö, researchers and practitioners that for 2 years have been investigating living conditions in the city. They see all the innovative creativity and the potential in the multicultural city with people from near 170 countries, but also deep inequalities, high unemployment, and alienation. The citizens in Malmö have become healthier and life conditions improved. But the polarization is increasing. If you live in the low income and high unemployment neighborhoods, your life expectancy is 5 years less than in other parts of the city. The same holds for citizens with shorter versus longer education. To close the gap in health, welfare, and justice, which is the fundamental challenge to become a socially sustainable city, they suggest a social investment policy, investments in people that go far beyond the traditional economic growth perspective. To achieve this, they recommend more democratic forms of innovation and governance through citizen participation and by building knowledge alliances across sectors, including industry and university, but also including key actors such as citizens, the civic society, and civil servants. This proud but torn city is the context and main focus for the research on experiments in innovation, design, and democracy in a forthcoming book out in November on MIT Press, in open published format, which I will not talk too much about today, but which collects 16 different examples of these kinds of innovations. The authors and the participants in this are all members of our collective design group based in Malmö, but also with networks out with many of the other of you. So what it looks at three kinds of challenges. It looks at social design, and there it specifically look at citizen-city collaboration. It looks at opening production and what would it mean to go towards a commons-based economy. It looks at creative class struggles on Creative Commons, but maybe more on the inequalities within the creative class, on those at the margin of the creative class, and what are their possibilities to act. And it looks at emerging publics' new forms of democratic thinking. and I think I'll leave it for you to read about designing conditions for the social, opening production, design and commons, creative class struggles, and emerging publics until we come to November. But in summary, I think I would say that democratizing design and innovation has to do with, when it comes to public space, going from public to production, it did, and maybe over to commons. The change has to do with going from technological innovation to multiple futures. That economy has to do with going from haunting marginal costs to engaging marginal resources. Innovation goes from new to well-composed, slow maybe, and from market-driven to commons-based. Actors goes from designers to all kind of participatory citizenship. Thinking goes from projects, no more projects, only infrastructuring and thinking. So I'm now come to the prologue where I want to summarize this, if I can find the paper. Here we go. So this was my response to the anthropologist and to the colleague from Silicon Valley and from the Orkney Islands. Dear archaeologists of the future and anthropologists of technoscience, this morning, during my daily morning bath, by the sound that out of Denmark, Sweden, Norway, cut Scandinavia together and apart, your beautiful, immutable mobile mailboats crossed my path. Your mailboat interaction, your thoughts on design and care for future being made across the Orkney Islands and the Silicon Valley fill me with curiosity and spark my imagination, but also make me want to share the futures being made by the waters where I fare. A collective designer of sorts, that's what I am. An oxymoron, of course, but please bear with me, there's more to come. In contemporary technoscience lingua franca, the collective designer is not the omnipotent maker of isolated objects of desire, but more a passionate participant among many in multiple unfolding things of design. These socio-material collective of human and non-humans are designerly appropriations of ancient Nordic things, political assemblies, rituals and places, making futures through controversial, agonistic matters of concerns, maybe as once at the Orkney Islands. The contemporary Scandinavian collective designer, some 40 years of age or so, Norwegian of origin, focusing on democracy and worker participation, actively searching alternative futures through collaborative design things, at a time when computers entered the shop floor, threatening to de-skill workers and tightening managerial control, pioneered at Kongsberg Walking Factory, maybe not the most likely place for an experiment in democracy and participation. But here's another paradox. At that time, the collective designer traveled over the seas, actually made it to the valley, but not as a controversial design thing, foregrounding trade unions, class struggle, and democracy, but as object-oriented design, a computer simulation language with active data objects that inherit properties from data classes. Rumors have it that translated into the program environment Smalltalk, it became part of technological futures being made in the valley. A decade later, the Scandinavian collective designer embarked on travels to Utopia. Not another nowhere, but the most socio-material interventions into the controversial now here. A Nordic design thing addressing the potential technological destruction of the typographer and his union by alternative design of computer tools for skilled workers and collaborative work organization. This was in the wake of the Mac-Apple revolution in the Valley, and the collective designer actually traveled there for technological inspiration. Yes, he was there 30 years ago in incognito. The outcome of Utopia resembled the Mac as object with mouse and graphic display, but with a different kind of thing, a participatory design thing, a typographer and designer collaboration, prototyping and exploring alternative socio-material futures through technological class struggle devices and political actions. Of this utopia, where workers craft new technology, the International Technological Press wrote with appreciation and much exaggeration, today Scandinavia, tomorrow perhaps the rest of the world. Paradoxically, they were partly right. 30 years later, this political utopian future-making practice still travels the world, but now politically marginalized, translated into a cornerstone in mainstream neoliberal user-driven innovation. Today, the collective designer, still concerned with matters of democracy and participation, has moved beyond the workplace and into ongoing, involving, controversial design things, centered around innovative actors from the outskirts of the city and the margins of society. What about the peripheries of your islands and your valley? Yours sincerely, out of Scandinavia, the collective designer. And I would have continued that, but I will not, but come to the very close of this. There's a painting by Paul Klee named Angelus Novus that Walter Benjamin writes about in his thesis on the philosophy of history as the angel of history. He's turning back to history that comes from paradise as a storm against him, and it's so strong that he cannot get his wings down. So in horror he sees it all the future coming to him, looking backwards. And Benjamin says, this storm is what we call progress. Remember, as reported from the Silicon Valley by the anthropologists of technoscience, the future arrives sooner here. This future of progress is as horrible as the ironic utopias of progress by Oscar Wilde, which I departed from in the beginning of this talk. So what I've tried to engage you in are attempts at other kinds of futures and utopias, of collective design, not siding with H.G. Wells, not with Oscar Wilde, not with Walter Benjamin, but rather with Bruno Latour's Compositionist Manifesto, commenting upon the angel of history and the shape of things to come. He writes, the moderns always had a future, the odd utopian future of something fleeing his past in reverse, but never a chance, until recently that is, to turn to what I could call their prospects, the shape of things to come. Faced with those new prospects, the first reaction is to do nothing. There is a strong, ever so modernist temptation to exclaim, let's flee as before and have our past future back, instead of saying, let's stop fleeing, break for good with our future, turn our back finally to our past and explore our new prospect, what lies ahead, the fate of things to come. Thank you.